My name is Mark Kamau, and I'm a human-centered designer. That involves doing a lot of contextual research to understand people within their contexts, their needs and aspirations, and then combining that with working with them to imagine the futures and solutions that work for the future that they aspire to. Instead of designing solutions for people, you design solutions with people. When we started and went to do this contextual research, the prevailing hypothesis was that the challenge the communities face, that if they can upscale their skills so that they can perform at an international standard, then that'll allow them to actually sell to these markets. So as we went to the community, there was a prevailing assumption that they need a skill upgrade. But then when we went to the communities, we actually found that their issue wasn't the skills. They were actually extremely highly skilled. In fact, they were producing these products for international markets. A case in point is one of the times I was there, a border motorbike came with a Giorgio Armani sample for them to actually embroider and create beads for. They're producing these high quality products for these international markets, but then they're impoverished. Amongst the insights we found was that there's a huge communication gap, in fact an exploitative environment, because while the client, for example, it would be Giorgio Armani who sends the work here, wants it to be sourced ethically and the people to be paid fairly, the reality is that often that is not the case. The person who gets the contract with Giorgio Armani kind of acts as a gatekeeper, so that the community never gets contact with the actual client. And that means then the terms on which the work is done are dictated by the middle company or the middleman. In that respect, then they will take, for example, whatever the sample would be, and so it's up to the community to interpret what that should be. Therein starts the problem. There is no standard way of actually briefing them on what needs to be made. The consequence of that is the community really is desperate to get the work, so they try to split themselves, like for example, to have 5 different people interpret this sketch so that they stand the best chance of getting it right. Because one person will look at it and say, I think this is what they need. Then they'll take the beads and then they'll create a sample. And then the second person will do their own interpretation and so on and so forth. This takes sometimes a week of their time. It involves buying materials, it involves hard labor to actually get that done. But then when they send it over, there is no agreement, them getting compensated for that time where they do the sampling. And so then the client often, if they don't like what was sent back to them, will just ignore them. But often there is no communication obligation from the client to actually communicate to them. So that's basically the engagement process. So there is no official contract. The sampling process does not involve any compensation for the materials or their labor. And then imagine a situation where one of the samples is picked. Then the third process becomes, so imagine they want 10,000 pieces. That involves basically aggregating members of the community to actually come together to produce it. What that then means is they have to train them to replicate exactly what this is so that there is consistency. That involves a huge training exercise. That involves beads, materials for the number of people who are going to do the production. What we found is often the client doesn't pay for that either. Doesn't pay for the materials, doesn't pay for the time. The client says, I'd like 10,000 of them, you figure it out. Therein lies another problem. There is no concerted way of aggregating or computing how much material it takes to produce one piece. So the client just guesses the amount of materials that are going to be used and sends that over. If the materials are depleted in between the process, sometimes the client takes 3 to 4 days to send additional material, but insists on the same deadline. So they have to figure out how to cover this 3-day deficit. And then after they finish producing this, they expect payment. But then there is no agreement of how they're going to be paid and the milestones or the terms of payment. So we had some horror stories where there are clients who worked with them and didn't pay them for 3 years worth of work. And to this community, that's a lot of money. I did an exercise where I called 80 of these companies that say they work with local artisans. And I asked them, do you employ them permanently? No. Can we give them a contract so that they do some work for us if you share their contacts? And all 80 did not give us the contacts to the communities, because then they are able to control them and to keep them hungry for work, and then obviously then this cycle continues. After gathering all these insights, we started thinking with the communities, what would be an ideal scenario be for you? And one of the things they wanted is predictability, so that they can live with dignity with their work, their working hours, and the income that they expect, that they're paid fairly. And so the first step was to understand what happens. So we gave them a design to produce, to understand how long does it take to produce one piece, how much material do you use to produce one piece. And so we looked at all the factors of production, time, materials, labor, and all that. And we were like, okay, how can we create a system that allows for them to always estimate the right amount of time, always estimate the right amount of materials, and always give the right kind of deadline based on what it takes to produce one piece. And then how do they then cost that and include their own wage amount? We created a template and we used a tool that is simple, Excel, that has macros. And so you have 3 lines, and then across the axis of those 3 lines, you're able to actually pick different bead colors and then place them into a design. And what that then does is it means by the time you finish designing on this Excel template, it calculates how many red beads are required, how many blue beads are required, and so on. So then that produces a brief that is simple for them to understand. As a client, you understand you need to buy, for example, for one bracelet, X number of beads in the numbers for each color. And that's very important for them because they're like, okay, now we know. Number 2, sometimes beads fall because they produce their work in remote environments because they're pastoralists sometimes. And so there's a percentage of them that will drop on the grass. So we include 10% in the production process to make sure that should someone drop a bead or one is faulty, then it's not so tightly spec'd that then there is a production deficit. We also understood that the client needs to be protected to understand the process so they understand what they're paying for. So making it simple for the client to understand and making it simple for the community. So that was taking care of the contracts and the briefing process. Now, a big Achilles heel in this process is the sampling process. So the client needs to understand that for the first time, maybe 3 people will need to actually produce this accurately 3 times each. 3 artisans all produce 3 good samples for you. So they come back to you and you'll be like, okay, I like this. And that process, unlike before, has to be paid for. And so all this we understood by taking a lot of time really trying to understand the process by seeing as they're doing it. So you can see at each process we actually taking it step by step. And then if you are happy with the sample, you could say, okay, now you can go produce 10,000 of this. And that introduces, okay, the 3 of us know how to do it, but for you to actually get 10,000 of them, the amount of time is determined by how many of them you need it and how soon you need them. So basically there's a calculation where fairly, it takes 4 hours to make one. So if I need 10,000 in one day, there's only so much time in a day, so we need X amount of artisans. All these processes are put together in the interest of the client, but also the community, so that it's a fair way of working together. We are creating a platform that's called basically the Opportunity Factory platform. And the idea is to make these communities visible globally so that they're able to actually, potential clients have access to them, and they also have access to new markets. And our hypothesis is that if they have access to a wide market, it means then they can choose and pick who they want to work for and who they want to work with. I think that there are other people who are trying to do this, but I think that the difference is that the solutions that people think about are imagined in boardrooms. The difference with OF is that the Opportunity Factory actually took the time to involve the communities. And I think that that then creates a different process. It creates a different perspective that centers the artisan. But if you look deeper, you find that some of these interventions are not solving the real root issues that these communities are. We are trying to do that, and that sets up the Opportunity Factory apart.